everyone, it's Orly, and we are back with another Cubica AMF Tech Tip podcast. I'm very excited today because we have a returning guest. We have Don Agent. He is the Director of Technical Support and Education over at Kegel. Don, first off, welcome back to the show. How are you doing today?
Doing fantastic. Thanks again for having me back. Really enjoyed the last show and looking forward to hopefully providing some secondary information to continue down this pathway to pattern selection.
Yeah, I appreciate you coming back to the show here. And if you're a first-time listener of the show, this show is a weekly podcast where I take you on a journey through the fascinating world of bowling technology and beyond. And Don, before we even go on, I gotta say, your show got a lot of hits. So either people just really wanted to hear your voice, or they thought the information was very important. So one or the other, either way, it was great to have you on the show, and we're super excited to have you back. So thanks, like I said, thanks again for joining.
Thank you so much. Glad to have the invite back.
Yeah, and if you didn't listen to the last show, Don was on here kind of just helping us, letting people know how to choose the house pattern that might be best for their center. And, he had so much information. We thought we'd have him back to kind of continue where we left off last time. So now that we have gathered, information on the last show about factors going into picking the lane patterns, what's the next stages that you would recommend people do?
Well, for this show, for the prime examples, two examples we're going to use for the pattern selection process, one of the big things was we got to identify the surface that we have in the bowling center from the last show. So we're going to basically say that, your two most popular used surfaces from a global perspective are QAMF or Brunswick. Okay, that truly in any tournament scenarios that I've done and hundreds and hundreds of centers have been in, that's really the benchmark for the lanes thus far. You still have some categories of wood lanes, which is we'll touch base on some things to look for those, but primarily those are going to be the two surfaces, and they're kind of split into two generations. So we're going to utilize the cubic AMF surfaces, which would have been HPL and now currently SPL. And then you've got, with your Brunswick surfaces, you have the anvil lane family. So you had anvil lane, you had pro anvil lane 1 and pro anvil lane 2, which are just different generations, but all of them take a few different tweaks to try to figure out what you're going to do. That being said, one of the other things we want to factor in is that we are under the assumption that we have, categorized who our clientele is. So we're going to just, for the sake of the audience, say it's a perfect environment. We've got a pretty good balance of competitive and recreational, and league bowling as well. So that being said, the next things going forward, once you've deduced what type of lane conditioner you're going to use, and regardless of what you're going to use, these three things we're going to discuss are all going to be the same relevance. Conditioners are different in the form that it's just like I said before, one shoe does not fit everyone, but we can make them all work really in all situations. So three of the things that we look at going forward now that we've gathered that other information and we know the intimacies of the bowling center and our clientele, is really going to revolve around the pattern length. Okay, the total length from when it starts applying the conditioner, at the front part of the lane until the ending part at the end, or what we would classify as the buff area, where oil is just applied by the buffer. It's not being applied live anymore from an additional system. We're going to talk about volume as well. And length and volume out of these three things that I'm talking about are the biggest fears for people in the industry. And a lot of that stems back from, historical issues where length and volume 20 or 30 years ago really translated into pin setter related issues, ball returns, sliding pins out of ranges, mechanical problems. The chemicals we use today are a lot different than we used back then. So I just want to let the people out there know that, don't be such in fear of putting longer patterns with more volume out today. That is really the norm. And the third thing would really be the ratio. And the ratio was terminology that we kind of coined as a company within the competitive world, and it trickled into all things from a lane maintenance standpoint. But ratio is kind of like a level of difficulty. Okay, no different than if you say, wow, I want to climb that mountain on a scale of 1 to 10, what would you say that would take? one being the lowest, 10 being, or one being the easiest, 10 being the hardest. Ratios are really the same way. The higher the ratio really translates into the higher the scoring pattern, or I hate to say easier the pattern is, but more so, more multiple angles are created, more styles are able to represent, and you typically have a more satisfied clientele as a whole. Just kind of reflect back a little bit. I know you came from the FEC side of it for the most part, and there, that traditional bowling, once again, that's just another part of the clientele. You still want to give your FEC customers, a predictable lane maintenance program. Okay. A lot of times people say, well, they're just so bullish, who cares? Lane maintenance should be consistent no matter who the bowlers are. They're all paying money to be there. So I really look at, no matter what you're going to do, really try to include all clienteles as a whole. When you go back to, I pulled up a seminar that I used to do back in 2006 because it had some relevant volumes and links back in that time frame, and just kind of let the audience know that this is where we can't get in fear of things, because just like life itself changes, so does lane maintenance and bowling balls and everything within our industry. So when you go back to 2006, the average pattern length, Orly, was minimum for a house pattern that was going to give you multiple angles and allow pretty much all styles to have a good experience, was going to be at a starting point of 37 feet with a maximum of 42, 43 maybe. But really, that was the area that everybody, 80% of the people, at least in this country, were back in 2006. So 37 to 42, 43 feet in length. And then your volume was 17 to 21 milliliters in total volume. Okay. Your ratio was essentially patterns for house conditions. Higher scoring patterns, multiple angle patterns were about 5 to 1 and higher. Okay. Usually didn't get above 8 or 10 to 1 at that stage. Okay. Now you come back here, 17 years forward, really right now, that average house pattern that was 37 to 42 feet. Well, the starting point for the average house pattern for the two brands I talked about, QAMF and Brunswick, the starting point's 43. Okay. So our minimum length is what our maximum length was 17 years ago. That's one point I wanted to bring up. And that can go up to 45, 46 feet. And I know people think, well, wow, the lane's only 60 feet, X amount for the head pin. But the reality is that as the ball technology changes and styles change, and you throw in even two-handed styles now, length of the pattern is a critical component taken into consideration. And it's not like you're applying oil all the way to 45 or 46 feet. Okay. You're typically only applying oil to maybe 35 to 38. And then what's happening is you're just allowing the buffer to continue to deplete the oil to where it steps it down and thins it out from a linear perspective. And that's what we call the front to back taper. Okay. So that's where pattern length sometimes scares people. I think we're loading oil all the way down there, and that's not the case. When it gets to volume, our highest was 21 mils back in 06. I mean, now we're telling people you're going to be in 27 to 30 milliliters of oil. I mean, and that's more than a 30% increase volumetrically. Once again, volumes terrified people simply because, from a mechanical perspective, and I grew up in that era where, with the conventional mineral oils that were being used back in the 80s and 90s and really even early 2000s, I mean, they were mineral oil based. There wasn't a whole lot of rocket science to them. So volume and length got you into dangerous situations because it affected the carry down and affected, how much the ball picked up and where it redeposited it down lane throughout travel. Today, all manufacturers that make any current conditioners are using additives that essentially allow that conditioner to not move as rapidly Therefore, increasing the volume, I want the public to think about, yeah, we're putting out more volume, but don't be in fear because it sticks better. Let's kind of say it that way.
Right.
It's not like you're putting a bunch of water on the lane versus, putting something that's a lot more viscous and that's going to actually, achieve contact angle to the surface. So really length, volume, and ratio are going to be the three things. The final thing being ratio. In today's house patterns, 2006, we were 5-1, 8-1, 5-1, 10-1, somewhere in that deal. And if you went beyond that, typically it's what people like myself referred to as you would get, it would be too square. It wouldn't be blended left to right, front to back. And you would essentially have, wet dry would be the terminology, where a bowler would hit the wettest part of the lane and miss the head pin to the right. And then if they threw the ball one board farther right and hit the dry part of the lane, they miss a head pin to the left. So there was really no room for error, and it was only conducive to one style. And that's really what we're trying to prevent, is that we're only allowing just the boomers to get in and strike, or only the low rev rate players that want to go, right up 8 to be able to get to the pocket. And that's not today's game. I mean, whether you're on the FEC end or on the league or competitive end, you see that there are many different styles and ways that people throw the balls. So when talking about the cubic AMF line, okay, you've got a product that was called HPL. And for us, once again, surfaces, to me, they're all good. I can make them all work. I mean, I really don't have a preference. Installation, I have a preference. But as far as surface itself, it's a canvas. It's what you want to paint on that. So when you're dealing with HPL, I mean, these lanes, are typically going to be 20 years to 30 years, even older. Okay. Whereas SPL came out in the early 2000s, I believe, mid 2000s, maybe, so that is a little bit of a newer surface. And this kind of goes into age of lane surface has a lot to do with that. We touched base a little bit on the last segment on that. So why I bring up age of lane surface is, it's kind of like a roof. My buddy John Janowitz says this. He goes, they say the roof will last 30 years, and it might. It might start leaking in 20, where it's not holding the water off. Well, kind of like a bowling lane. I mean, as surfaces get really beat up and you get extreme amount of lineage and abuse on the surface over time, it's not going to hold the conditioners well. So we have to be honest with ourselves on what are we dealing with versus what are we going to be able to achieve. So HPL is going to be really an older surface. SPL is more of a newer surface. And those two things would be attacked differently because they are two different friction levels, to the point that, we actually on that HPL, we're going to start off at 44 feet, as a minimum, and then go longer. And, we're going to be at that 28, 29, 30 milliliter, total volume of oil. Whereas if you had an SPL, we're going to be about in the same footage, but we might be a little bit less. We might be at that 28, 29, or 27 mils. SPL had a little bit more friction as a new surface than HPL did when it first came out. But as surfaces get older, they tend to hook more. When you're dealing with the Anvil and Pro Anvil, there were some different generations and styles of that. Anvil Lane was a surface that came out, I believe, in the late 80s, mid 80s. It was a great surface. Then they had Pro Anvil that came out, which was, that next phase. The difference between those two were extreme. Pro Anvil Lane, when that generation came out, to people like myself, it was, it just played slicker, longer, harder, all the different, descriptions that some bowlers have about it, where in our world that translated that we may at times, be less in length, and less in volume. Right. But the current Pro Anvil and the current SPLs, I mean, the range is relatively close from your starting points, which means don't be afraid to be in that 43, 44, 45 foot total length area. And don't be afraid to be close to 30 mils or even over. depending on the conditioner that you're using. And that's really what scares the people the most with it. When it comes back to the ratio, I said the ratios now are even higher than they were before. It's not that the wet dry problem still does not exist if you get too high, but more so what has happened is we had an industry change. Okay, some years back, we as our governing body, they decided that, hey, we're not going to utilize a minimum amount of oil that needs to be applied on every board anymore. That's what we used to refer to as the 3-unit rule. How we calculate a ratio is basically it's the highest part of the ratio means there's that much more oil at the highest, deepest part of the lane than there is at your most minimal applied oil. So, if you had, 20 units in the middle and you had 5 units at the lowest part on the outside, you're going to be at a 4-to-1 ratio. You have a lot of people now that are not putting any oil on the outside boards because they don't have to. So now all of a sudden that ratio is amplified and it comes off as 16, 18, 20 to 1. So it's kind of misleading. But when you're looking at the terminology of that, the higher the ratio, the more scoreability you're going to have within the pattern and the more angles you're going to be able to hopefully produce. All right. When you start to select a pattern, one of the easiest ways if you're new to the business, is try to utilize some of the tools that are available from different manufacturers, ourselves obviously included. On our website, we've got a thing called the pattern library, and you can actually go in, select the surface you have, select, the level of difficulty you want. Select these different factors in these menus that we're actually discussing now, and essentially it will spit out a pattern that we've utilized in those scenarios that have been very successful as a starting point. Because the thing to picking a pattern is very rarely is it going to be 100% set it and forget it. It's always a starting point. You've got to get out to, the next layer is you've got to get out and watch bowling. I used to tell people, don't listen, look. That means bring your clientele into the selection experience. This is difficult because this terrifies people, especially mechanics. Oh, God, I don't want my bowlers to know what we're putting out. No, that's the opposite. We have the internet today. The information's everywhere. You don't want to hide things from people. As a lanesman, I've spent my whole life being transparent, as John Davis taught us. And for us, it was about educating people on why we make these decisions and the good and bad that can come from making, the proper decision versus an improper decision. So I always suggest that, when you're going to start out with a pattern, at bare minimum, set up a time, donate that time, which means you're going to gather a handful of bowlers. Maybe that's 5 or 6 people. You don't want too many, but you want some legitimate people. And when I say legitimate, I mean, that's who your clientele is. Not legitimate as in, well, I'm going to get all 5 of my top scratch bowlers. That's not going to help your whole situation. You want to help everybody. You want to help that bowler from 140 get to 160, and that 160 get to 190, and that 190 to get to 210. And to be honest with you, if you're averaging over 210, you should be able to adjust. Okay. Whereas the other people are going to have more difficulty. So, it's one of those things where I'll tell the proprietors when we put a pattern out, let's get a scratch bowler. Let's get a left-hander. Let's get a couple of seniors, male and a female. Let's get a youth bowler. If we got a good youth program, get a percentage of all of your clientele so that now you can get them all out on the pattern and truly see if one size is going to fit all for that starting. From that point, then you make the tweaks based on the groups, which means that, in last segment, we talked a little bit about seniors. I'm in Florida. I have a lot of seniors. Too much volume or not enough is detrimental to that age group. They are older. They are throwing current equipment, which requires ball speed that a lot of them do not have anymore. Requires either reduced rotation or different hand positions that are just harder to repeat as we get to that age. Therefore, volumes and lengths and ratios are a little bit more sensitive for your senior clientele than it will be for the rest of your clientele. In a lot of those cases, we've had situations where we've picked a pattern and we said, wow, this is fantastic. And it's going to be 44 feet and it's 28 mils, but it's too much volume for our seniors. So we keep maybe the pattern length the same, but we reduce the overall volume and just thin it out a little bit more. So that also goes to, the starting pattern is just that for majority of your clientele. But you're always going to have to take into consideration that, unlike 20 or 30 years ago, you are possibly going to have, and more than likely, multiple patterns in your bowling center for the multiple clienteles you have, unless you are just that extremely lucky. That, and it's very few and far between anymore today. From an FEC perspective, what were some of the things that you guys experienced trying to set up patterns in your center?
When we got on, to be honest, we were all new to it, so we had someone come in and kind of just, I think they just kind of based it off another FEC. But, we'd get people in there just there for fun, whether it's kids or, but then every once in a while I would get somebody come in that's like, hey, this, they wanted it to be what they wanted it to be. And I would kind of just, hey, we're new to this. We're, and then from there we kind of learn from people. And it would be cool as you get bowlers, I'm nothing towards some of them, but you'd get some grumpy people coming in.
Oh, yes.
This lane pattern isn't what we used to bowling on. I'm like, well, sir, we're kind of new to this. And what would really be cool is a lot of them would take the time to help us out and give us information, just, not as much information as you just gave, but they would try to help and give us information to help us get it best on track for what they thought would help us out. So we would always appreciate that. But yeah, like I said, for somebody that is an FEC center, this might sound scary to a lot of them, like you were saying, but the knowledge you have with it, you're like kind of what can we say, like the encyclopedia, the lane pattern encyclopedia. And for those that don't know what an encyclopedia is, how would you explain it? Let's see, a book full of information before the internet.
Encyclopedia Britannica.
Yeah, but
we had a lot of great mentors, and that's the wonderful thing about this industry in Kegel. Though I appreciate the compliment, these are things that I've learned through just amazing people that I've been around in the world, and unfortunately, some of these people are no longer with us. The John Davises and the Mo Pinnells and the Bill Taylors, and then a whole nother level of professional bowlers, Norm Dukes and Walter Rays, and even our own homegrown John Janowitzes. So it's one thing that I will say, that this evolves constantly. And this really was kind of at a stalemate, I'd say, up until the early 90s. And what I mean by that was there wasn't a whole lot of changes in conditioners that were out or pattern theories. The technology on oil application was very minimal at that point. So there wasn't a whole lot of changes that went. Now, as everything has progressed, literally, I'd make an example of 30% change within 17 years, but also when you look at it as an every 5 years, there were changes every 5 years, and we continue to watch that. So, that's one thing I'll always tell the group to, what works today, as cliche as it sounds, isn't necessarily going to work, 2, 3, 4, 5 years from now. If all of a sudden you walk in one day and overnight your scores have gone down the tank and everything's the same, you've got to find out what change happened. Did your clientele evolve? Did they change? Did equipment change? Did you put in new lanes? What happened there, and what is acceptable and what is not acceptable as far as change goes? The next stage of patterns, like you said, the reason I asked the FEC question is because, unfortunately, a lot of people in the FEC standpoint, they are so new to the business that there isn't a manual for this.
Yeah.
And a lot of their clientele, really, for the most part, they're throwing, plastic house balls, and they're out there for fun. They're not really people that necessarily understand ball reaction, or are definitely not going to understand ball reaction with the equipment they're using. But then you get the other small percentage, like you said, that comes in and it's like, wow, I bowl down the street and I'm a league bowler. and this is unacceptable. Is it unacceptable? It is for that person, but it's for the rest of your clientele, it's perfectly fine. And that's what I'll kind of close off as one of the main points. Don't chase ghosts. Okay. Do not chase that one or two or three people that complain the most, a squeaky wheel, as we would call that. You know, I mean, that's where it's always important to look, like I said, not just listen, because a lot of times people make lane condition changes or pattern changes based on either bad information or information from a very small group that has a very large voice. And the larger group that pays all the bills for the bowling center, they basically don't get hurt in the end. And so that's why for me, it's always, once again, multiple patterns is a very good thing to always take into consideration, especially when you've got, you know, a wide array of different clientele. I mean, today we've got college programs, high school programs, you know, I mean, you've got seniors, you've got people that just want recreational once a year. We're all across the board. I mean, that's what makes bowling so wonderful.
Yeah, and that's a good thing. It's a good thing for bowling, you know.
Absolutely.
And to keep it around that way, you know, we have new people coming into, and maybe they start off bowling for fun, but then, hey, you know, I want to get more competitive, and they get into leagues. So that any kind of customers you have, I think is a good thing.
I would say probably the next, if we're going to do another one of these to cap it off, I would probably I'd probably sit down and go over some of the different conditioners, not necessarily the brands themselves as much as the characteristics and the grouping of those. Okay, because that is, you know, people would be like, well, God, wouldn't that be one of the first things that you'd pick? Well, it is one of the questions that we ask on, you know, picking a pattern, but more importantly for me, it's surface and machine. Like I said, I can make any conditioner work. I mean, period. You know, we have the tools to do that. Some just work better in certain situations than other. You know?
All right. Well, I think you guys just heard it there. It sounds like Don is committing to coming back to the show. So Don, we appreciate the first 2 times, and we're looking forward to having you back a third time.
My pleasure. Hopefully it wasn't too long-winded. And hey, everybody, go bowling. That's all I can say.
Yep. Have a great one, everyone.